Hi everyone, I'm Jeannie Jones. Welcome to session 11 of Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament. We are almost done. Today I'm going to talk about 3 reasons to focus on eternity and how to do it. You may have noticed that every chapter in the book ends with eternity. That's because both the Old and New Testament tell us the importance of focusing on eternity. And today we're going to look at one such passage. As we live in this world, we end up encountering a lot of bad things amid the good things that the Lord blesses us with. There's sin, there's wickedness, there's pandemics. There's a number of things that can go wrong in our lives. Betrayals, losses, things like that. So what do we do when these difficulties hit us? Well, the answer is going to be focus on eternity, as we'll see in just a moment. One time I was in a position where I had somebody over me who I thought was a friend and who ended up letting me go from the position and in the process spread lies about me. I was shocked because I thought she was a friend and I felt so hurt and betrayed. Well, Clay suggested, I want you to memorize Colossians 3, 1-4. It turned out to be a very good thing. Now, you yourselves have faced many things like that, betrayals and injustices. Everybody does to some extent or another. And this is going to be a verse that I think will bless you as much as it has blessed me. Let's take a look at it. Colossians 3, 1-4 reads, Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Now here's the outline of this particular passage. Paul gives reason 1 for looking to eternity, command 1, command 2, then reason 3 for looking to eternity, and reason 4. Now this is pretty common in the Bible to have the important portion be in the middle and be surrounded by other things that are linked. So this is our outline. We're going to go through it verse by verse. Let's start with verse 1. Colossians 3:1 reads, Since then you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. So reason 1 for looking to eternity is that you have been raised with Christ. Now remember an earlier video when we talked about the 3 stages of eternal life, and we talked about how we're in stage 1 right now. Our spirits have been made alive, but they're still in this body, this physical body that is going to die. Paul has already talked about this earlier in the letter. Let's look at what he said. Colossians 2:12 reads, Having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. Now, New Testament scholar G.K. Beale tells us more about this passage. He says, As their baptism identifies them with Christ's death, so it also identifies them with his resurrection. The mention of the believer's resurrection, followed by Christ's resurrection, probably alludes again to his representative role. Because Christ has first been raised, their union with him means that they also are raised up with him. So then, because we have been raised with Christ, we need to follow 2 commands. Let's go back to verse 1. Here's verse 1 again. Since then you have been raised with Christ, that's the reason, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. So the command here is set your hearts on things above. So we're to set our hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Now, that seated at the right hand of God, you might recognize that. In chapter 6 of Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament, we looked at Psalm 110. And Psalm 110 begins with, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit here at my right hand while I make your enemies your footstools. So this passage is alluding back to Psalm 110, and it's telling us that Jesus is at a place of power and judgment. And since we've been raised with Christ, we now need to set our hearts, that is our desires, on things above, not on earthly things. Let's move on to the second command now. Colossians 3:2 reads, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. So the second command is to set our minds on things above. The first command was about our hearts, about our desires. This one is about our values. Are we going to value temporal things, things that aren't going to last on this earth? Or are we going to value eternal things, things that'll last eternally? Now, Paul has already explained some of what he means in the previous chapters. You see, this was a Gentile church, and some others had come in and had some false teaching. They told them, first of all, that they had to add in a lot of the Jewish laws, basically become Jewish in a lot of ways, in order to fully access God. And they also were bringing in a lot of teachings that they used to have. They believed that there were elemental forces and that you ought to worship angels and things like that. They were bringing in all of these religions and kind of mixing them together. They were taking what Paul was teaching about Christianity, what some Jews were teaching about the law, and their old teachings and beliefs from before they became Christians, and were trying to mix it all in some way. And they were also having a mix of asceticism too, which is don't do this, don't do that. You've got to, deny yourself a lot of stuff. So it was kind of a mess. And Paul is calling all of those things, all of those additions to Christ's work, earthly things. Now he's going to be coming back to what earthly things he means in just a few minutes, and we'll look at that again. But the first earthly things he wants them to get rid of is anything that they're adding to the work that Christ already completed. Now, at the end, I'm going to give us very practical examples. So that's just the first example. Paul's going to give us more, and then I'm going to give us very practical ways to apply these verses to our lives. Colossians 3:3 gives us another reason. He says, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. So reason 2 is you have died, and your life is hid with Christ in God. This is something that Paul's already talked about in the previous chapter. So let's look at what he said about our death. Colossians 2:20-22 reads, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings? So the elemental spiritual forces have to do with the Greeks thought that the world was comprised of 4 elements, fire, water, earth, and air, and that these were governed by spiritual forces. So in the Old Testament, it tells us that when people sacrificed to idols, they were actually sacrificing to demonic forces. So now they were blending this all together and coming up with these elemental spiritual forces thing, and Paul is saying, you died to all of that. G.K. Beale says, believers' death with Christ has separated them from their part in the old fallen world, the elements which no longer have control over them. He goes on to say, consequently, when Paul says you have died with Christ from the elements of the world, he means your identification with Christ's death has caused you to die to the old world and to be separated from that world. Although believers have been removed only spiritually from the old world, the sure consummation of this process will result in their full physical resurrection and complete removal from the old creation at the final coming of Christ. So, our life is hid with Christ. That means non-believers often don't see that we have got this new life in us. It's concealed from them. But it is safe, it is protected, it is with Christ, and we have it. Colossians 3:4 has our third reason to look to eternity. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. So reason 3 is you will appear with Christ in glory. That's pretty awesome. That's coming at the resurrection, and it's a sure thing that we can look forward to. We have a glorious future awaiting us. Now, Paul goes on to talk a little bit more about those earthly things that he wants us not to be involved with. Colossians 3:5-9 reads, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Those are the desires, the earthly desires, the things that they're setting their hearts on. He continues, because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices. When we set our hearts on earthly things and we don't get those things, it results in anger, rage, malice, slander, and lies. Not good. Now Paul goes on to tell us how to set our minds on things above. Let's read that. Verses 12 to 13 read, "Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive." So what do those traits and forgiving have to do with thinking on eternity? Let me explain. Let's say we face disapproval. Somebody is disapproving of the way we act or how we've done something, and maybe we really wanted their approval for some reason. Well, the earthly desire is to have people's approval, right? But we can replace that with the heavenly desire to please God, to have God's approval, right? And then we can also think about the resurrection and the judgment for rewards, and we can think on what we can do in order to hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." You see how that works? So we take our earthly desires, which perhaps have been denied and not given something we wanted, like maybe somebody's approval, and we switch it to heavenly things. Let's look at another example. What about betrayal? When we've been betrayed and we're hurt and rejected, we can forgive. And the reason we can forgive is because we cannot lose anything of eternal value. People can only take from us things of earthly value. If someone lies about us or mistreats us or steals from us, we lose something of earthly value, but no one can take anything from you of eternal value. Not only that, but when we go through hardships, with our faith intact and walking closely with the Lord, putting our thoughts on things above and trusting God through it, God rewards us, and that's of eternal value. Let's look at a third example, the pandemic. When we look at the pandemic and we see, goodness, things are going on around here, and some people are going to die earlier than they thought. We may even get very ill ourselves, and all of us are getting older, and that means things break down over time. When we look at these physical ailments and physical threats, we can look to eternity and remember the resurrection. The Lord God is resurrecting us to a glorious body that will not be able to be affected by any pandemic. It's not going to have the ailments and joint pains and other issues that are going on in this world, because this world is ending and God is resurrecting us and bringing us to the new heavens and earth. And that's our glorious future. Let's conclude then by reading our passage one more time. "Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." Now, I memorized that passage in a slightly different version. The NIV 2011 hadn't even come out back then. But I do recommend that you, at some time in your journey here with Christ, memorize that passage. Try to draw it out like Carla does, or something. Do anything that will help you memorize it, or just write it out so you can carry it with you and read it when you're having a difficult time. This is an amazing passage. It has brought me so much joy and helped to correct my thinking when I was concentrating on earthly things instead of heavenly things. Thanks for watching. Please answer the questions in the comments. This week, complete chapter 11, which is on Jesus, the Son of Man, and the hope of Jesus' return. See you next time.